Hey guys, it's Mitch. How's it going? This ought to be fun. What we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at an extremely famous comic that I think is probably up there in terms of most read comics of all time, as described by a dude who just read it for the first time. That'll be good, right? Of course, I'm talking about Batman number 497, which is the issue where Batman got his back broken. And I never read it before now because I didn't think I needed to. And I mean, I was kind of right. Everybody knew exactly what was happening in this issue. Everybody knew it at the time. There's no spoilers with Batman 497. And honestly, after Superman number 75, I didn't have any kind of faith in DC pulling off any kind of big time event. I really kind of figured those two comics were basically the same thing. We had what was supposed to be this big momentous event that was undercut by unspectacular artwork. And I mean, there's definitely some of that going on in here. I am not a fan of Jim Aparo. I don't think I've ever really been. He was the guy drawing Batman when I was a kid. I never thought his stuff was particularly exciting. It's just yeah, that's what comics looks like. And then not too long after, I remember picking up a couple of issues from Craven's Last Hunt and being like, why does this look better than regular comics? Jim Aparo to me is house style guy. He's not even elevated house style guy. He's just guy who can draw everything on a schedule. He doesn't make it imaginative or dynamic, but he'll get it done and it'll be professional. Now, that said, I understand why Jim Aparo was on this particular issue. In fact, a whole bunch of people managed to get in on this particular issue. And for good reason, because there's royalties to be had in Batman number 497. This is one of those issues that's going to be reprinted forever. So from what I understand, the editor at the time was Dennis O'Neil, and he lobbied to get Aparo put on the book for this particular crossover. Because Jim Aparo had been a loyal soldier, essentially. And he'd been keeping the Batman franchise going along for quite a while, really. And this is kind of a case of we're going to take care of Jim's retirement. And I can't bitch about that. Dude does his job. He does it well enough. He does it for decades. And he's a good guy in the office, and as a reward, he's given this nice pension. That's a good story. I hope I get that kind of thing one day. But anyway, I guess we should probably just get into the lead up. So the whole deal is there's this new Batman villain named Bane. Batman doesn't know anything about him. Turns out Bane was born in a prison and grew up there. I think he spent 10 years in solitary and took the prison over, managed to escape eventually or get released, probably got to escape. And while he was in prison, he was told about Gotham, told about Batman, and he kind of fixated on them and decided that he wanted to take down Batman and take over Gotham. It's, classic supervillain stuff, right? So his plan was to set loose every supervillain in Arkham Asylum and get Batman chasing after them, which had a chance to be a very mediocre story. I mean, that's not the most imaginative turn of events that could have happened, but the way they did it is actually pretty good, where Batman is getting slowly worn down by having to deal with just madman after madman after madman. He's dealing with Two-Face, he's dealing with the Riddler, the Joker, and, also psychopaths like Zsasz, and just all sorts of guys I don't even know about. And at the same time, he's not sleeping, he's just on the run constantly trying to respond to these threats. He gets sick, because of course he does. His body is being put through the ringer. Him and Robin keep yelling back and forth at each other because Batman keeps stealing the credit for the takedowns or something. I don't know exactly what the deal was there. But, just his life is a living hell. And it seems kind of never ending at the time. And then at the end of it all, when he's on no sleep, his body he's depleted all his reserves. He comes home to the mansion and he finds out that Bane is there waiting for him. So let's get into it here. We can start with the cover, which is just great. I do love Kelly Jones, and this thing is ridiculous. How impossibly massive Bane is. It's important, We want to get across that this guy is unbeatable. And bending Batman to an extreme degree. Not sure why he's naked. He's not in the comic. I feel like Kelly Jones just kind of assumed that he went topless or something. And then the colorist had to make up the gloves. And it's we can't do anything about the nipples. But yeah, great looking cover. Batman's got all his oblique tumors, because that's a Kelly Jones staple. Not a particularly good T-Rex head. This is, I think, just before Jurassic Park comes out, so that's something. But still, we weren't trying too hard to make that look, I know it's like a robot or something, but still, they weren't trying too hard to make it lifelike, were they? And all these Nightfall issues had great covers by either Kelly Jones or Sam Keith. So they got that part right at least. All right, so yeah, as I said, Bruce Wayne gets home. He's in his smoking jacket over his costume, which means either his brain was so addled that he thought that would be enough to disguise him, or this is really how he gets comfortable after a hard night of kicking ass, as he goes home and, he doesn't take his costume off. He just slips the smoking jacket over and just goes, ah. This is what it means to be a Wayne. So anyway, yeah, comes out from behind the clock because, secret passages and all that shit, and finds, well, for one thing, Alfred, who's been knocked out in front of the clock, and big, hairy-shouldered Bane waiting for him here. And, we get a splash page. It's not a bad splash page. He went for a pretty extreme angle. It might have been a little better if he'd gone for a lower angle to make it look as though Bane is towering over him. But I think this is about as much as Jim Apato's gonna do most days. And before he does, we get our close-up of Bruce Wayne here looking, again, I'd like to see him look more beat up, because he does go through the ringer before this. And he just kind of looks, tired. He looks like Joe Schmo, which is fine, but, I just like a bit more there. So Batman naturally is thrown off that Bane knows who he is and where he lives. Although Bane goes by the whole thing that Batman isn't the mask, Bruce Wayne is the mask, Batman is who he really is. Bane juices himself up with his venom, which Batman, of course, is familiar with, because, Batman's familiar with most things. And then he cuts WWE promos about how great his venom is. The sheer strength and ferocity now coursing through my veins is enough to break a man, any man, like a dead stick. And we're just kind of pumping up the fight here. The art, it's not my thing. It's too boring. We're getting the same angles almost constantly. This is about as far as Jim Aparo is usually willing to go in terms of varying up the page layout. Is the one, weirdly angled panel here. And for no real purpose other than, I guess, to just give Bruce Wayne a little bit more headroom. We got our guy here, and he's pretty muscular, although, again, it's 1993. If you're reading Marvel or Image Comics around this time, you're used to guys being a lot more muscular than that. And then he juices up, and he doesn't really get any bigger. There's awkward shit going on with the hands. Here he appears to be doing the Ross fuck you thing. That being said, everything reads fine. And I think that's kind of the main point here, is to just, for a house-style kind of guy, you want to make sure that people can just see what's going on. You want to be able to draw everything clearly, make sure everything has, a proper context where you're not confused about where people are in the room or what kind of actions people are doing. And, Jim Aparo does that fine. He's going to do it fine throughout. And now we get down to motivation here, where Bruce still doesn't really know what Bane wants. And of course, Bane wants Gotham. He wants to rule Gotham. And Bruce is like, well, you killed for that? He's like, I'd kill for anything. This is an interesting page layout here, where, this is essentially one, like a splash here in the background. But he breaks it up into 3 panels, so there's no confusion about which order to read in. It's very clear. You read here, you read here, you read here, and then down here. So that's all fine. We're still just leading up to it. And now Batman has to try and get into character. So, pulls on the cowl and goes leaping towards Bane. But you see what I mean? We're not really trying to make any of these shots particularly dramatic. You could pretty easily by just turning the camera or tilting it slightly. Maybe do a little bit of dramatic shadows. But of course, if you throw the room into a lot of shadow, then later on when, you're actually getting into the action, it might potentially make it difficult to discern what's going on. And I don't think Jim Aparo's cool with just throwing, dramatic shading on a guy without the proper context. So without keeping it continuous throughout the fight. So anyway, yeah, Batman leaps at him and immediately gets knocked aside, thrown into one of the, the displays here. Gets picked up, thrown to the other side of the room. And he's just getting knocked all over the place, immediately getting tossed around like a rag doll. And we keep flashing back to what's been going on over the course of the crossover. And we're going to continue to do that throughout the course of the issue. So, just fighting other guys. I don't know who most of these guys are. I don't think I know who any of these guys are. But it does kind of help to build up that this time, maybe, for the first time in a long time, Batman isn't in good enough shape to get into the fight he's gotten himself into. Keep flashing back to earlier in, the week, the month, the year, when he's taking down, villain after villain, and the cost is getting higher and higher in terms of just the physical damage he's taking. Getting stomped, getting backhanded. Alfred gets up to go and get some help. We keep flashing back. Apparently he fought a venomed up Riddler at one point. And this is the kind of stuff I think that Jim Aparo is actually getting across fairly well, because there's a lot of information to get on this page here. Stuff like this, where you get Batman against a half dozen goons. It's tough to draw it in a way that looks cool, and if that's what your focus is, you're probably not going to make it very clear. So Jim Aparo, he's just not going to go for cool most of the time, but he is going to go for clarity, so at least you know what's going on in this panel. And Batman's barely able to roll out of the way of punches. We're going to flash back to how he hasn't been sleeping. because he hasn't had time to sleep. There was a thing here earlier where he says passing blood for weeks, which is like, Jesus Christ. Gets an opening, tries to get a little bit of offense in, and, just does nothing. If anything, I think this sound effect is a bit too harsh. It should be just like a bap. And again, it's kind of a goofy looking like the expression that he comes up with for Batman here is, you probably like a little bit more determination than just like, eh. Gets kicked off the landing down into, I guess we're in the Batcave now. And so down below and comes up behind him, cracks him in the back. He's going to start working the back now, like it's wrestling again, which is fitting. I mean, he's got the luchador mask and everything, but that's the whole deal. If you want to like sell later on in the match that a guy's like shoulder is too fucked up to do a particular move, or for him to take the damage of another guy's finisher, then you work the shoulder throughout the match. So they're going to do that kind of thing where Bane works Batman's back. Flashing back again to the breakout with Jim Apato's Joker. I'm not fond of Jim Apato's Joker. And again, this is another one where you could have gone with some dramatic lighting. But it feels like Jim Aparo just gets into drawing mode, and he's not really thinking about things like that. He's not even really thinking about the most interesting way to present information. It's just present the information in a way that's clear and, hopefully a little bit fun, but that's not the priority. Clarity is the priority. And Batman's still running off to try and find Robin. More flashing back of Batman getting the shit kicked out of him all week. And again, back to the present where Kane boots him into the coin. The coin falls onto his lower back. Again, we're working the back. Smashes him into the car. And a shot that feels way too long. But, this is the kind of thing I could see trying to be done as the way they did Superman 75, where you do it as all splash pages or close to. I mean, I think Superman 75 showed us why you probably don't want to do that in most comic books, unless it's fucking Thor number 380. Is that if your comic has any kind of story where it's got moments aside from just, action, then it's going to have to do those in smaller panels. And they decided they had to stick with the whole splash page thing. So you get splash pages that no one has any kind of interest in. But I could see this fight being done like that, where like maybe it's 2 panels per page, or, you break it up a little bit. But you could get much bigger impacts out of this. Of course, that's the kind of thing, like Jim Aparo has been working on this comic for months leading up to this. He's not going to have the schedule to pull off that book. And honestly, would it even look that impressive if he did? But I think as a culmination, this does actually work, which is not something I expected to say. Again, I expected this to be Superman number 75, where we're just piling on the abuse and showing all the abuse that's already been piled on. So when Bane does a really weak karate chop and takes off a stalagmite here to beat Batman with, we're not doing it in a cool kind of way where, Bane's all worked up and he just grabs the nearest thing. It happens to be a rock and he breaks it off. It looks, a little bit dainty. But again, it's kind of, at least it's clear what's going on. And I mean, at this point, you don't really even need me to narrate. It's going to be the same thing. This is what we were sold. And at least in that respect, the comic is absolutely honest, and the marketing was honest. Batman is going to get the living shit kicked out of him by Bane, and then Bane is going to break his back, and that's going to be the end of the comic. And that's everything in the comic, essentially. I guess this is kind of like the harshest things have gotten here, where Batman gets tossed back into the Robin outfit display, and this is, as rough as he looks, where just his costume is a little shredded up. And he should be in way worse shape than this at this point, I feel like. And, and then you get stuff like this in here. This is part of the Nightfall storyline. This is in Showcase, I think. This is drawn by, this isn't drawn by Klaus Janson, but the comics are. This is one of the covers by Glenn Fabry. But, that's a more 90s appropriate Batman, I feel like. Anyway, Alfred goes running up to, I guess, there's got to be a different part of the mansion, right? And, goes and gets Tim, tells him that some bad shit's going down in wherever Bruce is. This stuff is all fine. Again, it's all very clear what's going on. It doesn't even look particularly dramatic. This is another thing. There's no hurriedness to this part of the story. Like if you took this page out of context, you wouldn't really think there's any kind of rush. There's not much pace to the panels. If you were to get the maybe like McFarlane type panels where they're like super skinny and just line them up beside each other here, so you get like a really quick kind of pulse to them, that might work. You could go for some dramatic lighting, but he's just not going to do that. He's not going to do any lighting really. So anyway, back to the fight. Batman tries to throw a punch, but he's got nothing left. Bane parries him easily, and then knocks him on his ass one more time, stomps him in the face. And Batman isn't even putting up any kind of defense at this point. His hands are just flopping around in front of him. And I think this is meant to be him thrown on a different part of the floor, where there's more stalagmites, which almost pierce him, but they don't, but he says R anyway. And we're getting to the end of the fight here, so we're going to flash back to just basically what Bruce has been coming home to, which is that he's been exhausted and beat up every night, and Alfred and Robin, try and just pack him away and get him like 2 hours of sleep before he can go out again. And he's starting to realize that this might be it. Bane kind of, bitch slaps him at this point. We get the actual 60s show, like suck. Not even sound effects, just the graphic around them. And then lifts him up. Kind of a weak stance. This was pointed out before. But, if you look at like the Marvel method, in How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, where it shows this is how you draw a figure, this is how you don't draw a figure, this is how you don't draw a figure when you want to make him look strong and imposing with his feet kind of close together. You want to do a power pose where his feet are wider apart. I know this has been talked about in other videos, but particularly on Cartoonist Kayfabe. It's just like, yeah, it's very evident. And, Batman looks beat up, but not any more beat up than he gets at the end of a lot of fights, really. And then we get the Break You, which at least it was a splash page, but it's kind of a medium shot. And, he gets the full figure in there, which is fine, I guess, although you probably want it closer. And there's not really any intensity to it. Not only that, but we've been working the lower back throughout the course of the fight. And then when he, drops him over his knee, he drops him on his upper back here, which is bad selling. And yeah, not really a whole lot in terms of intensity. The sound effect here isn't particularly great. Just like a medium-sized cracked off to the side. Like it should be just brutal. It should be just like crunch and just like made out of like bone with like cracks going through it and like blood splattering out. I mean, like that's a bit much for a Batman comic maybe. And that's still in the Comics Code Authority days, but And then Bane just drops him at his feet and says broken and done. And that's where we're going to end things. And, it's a fine enough ending. As in, it's not particularly dramatic. It's not particularly intense. The art isn't anything to get excited about at any point. And it's kind of interesting, actually, in that what it manages to do then is it just kind of makes the Breaking of Batman into an average Batman story. Like when you get Jim Aparo to draw it, that's what you're going to end up with, is just a run-of-the-mill Batman story. At the end of this one, Batman just happened to get his back broken. Superman definitely wanted to make it a huge event, and then they just didn't execute it. This feels like it's just been, a regular Batman story, and it's the writing that's been kind of elevating it. It's an average Batman comic. Everything looks exactly as you expect it to because Jim Aparo's drawing this, and he's been drawing some variation of Batman for like 20 years at this point. And just for some reason, right around issue 500, everything started to get more intense. And we had this situation where Batman has just run ragged, and it just ended badly this one time. So I will say, in terms of story, it does actually work, which I wasn't really expecting. It's 1993. Even a lot of DC comics had thrown in the towel on storytelling at this point. But yeah, I do get the impression reading the whole Nightfall thing leading up to it does actually kind of make it pay off more. I kind of flipped through it a little bit beforehand, and it does make it a more rewarding climax in that way, which, yeah, hey, good job to him. I hate how it looks. It's just weak sauce throughout. It's not intense. It's not interesting looking. It's kind of, same boring old Batman. That said, Jim Aparo, if anybody, deserved to get the royalties for the Breaking of Batman's back. Definitely he's the guy who deserved it more than anybody else at that time. It would be cool if these landmark issues were actually cool to look at when you went back and flipped through them, but that's just not the case. At least the story in this one holds up. Superman 75 is still just not worth going back and rereading at any given point. But of course, it's tough not to compare that breaking splash page to the cover here that we got from Kelly Jones, which is naturally way more impressive. But, in 1993, Kelly Jones isn't a definitive Batman artist. Jim Aparo is. So, again, totally all right with him getting the nod in this case. So anyway, feel free to yell at me in the comments for not having read the Nightfall storyline before this. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to read it, going forward either. I'm sure it's pretty good as far as Batman stories go. But, I'm of the opinion that no Batman story touches Larry Hama's Wolverine. So that's just where I stand. Anyway, that's going to do it for this one. Thanks very much for watching. If you like this video, please hit the like button. It helps with the algorithm. Or you can hit dislike. That works fine too. If you want to see more, hit subscribe. If you really want to help out, in the description, there's a link to my Patreon. If you go subscribe there, that gives you access to everything I do. So a whole bunch of comic book art, a whole bunch of videos. You can also follow me on Instagram and DM me there for commissions. Commissions are open. So yeah, that's going to do it. Thanks again for watching, guys. I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.